Hello, everyone. Let's take a look at the study questions for the Federalist number 10. This was written by James Madison, who would become the fourth president, I think, of the United States later on. Um, the Federalist Papers, which were a number of newspaper pieces that were published around the time of the Constitutional Convention to argue for basically a strong federal government. Number one, what is a faction? Well, if we looked at the classical definition of faction, it mentions it's a minority within a political community that has a common interest. You might say a special interest. I'm wrong in saying that. But for Madison, a faction is any group, majority or minority, that is motivated by a common interest. We see here what he has to say about it. Let's make it a little bigger. This is from Madison. He says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So any group within a political community that is united by a common interest, which is adverse to the rights of people outside that group, that is, tends to violate their rights, or is adverse to the public good as a whole. So, for example, say that say I'm a factory owner, and my factory pollutes the environment. Then I have an interest, let's say, in making money and making as much money as I can, and so do the other factory owners. So we have a common interest in not being regulated in terms of our pollution, right? And that could be said, and it certainly is true, that polluting the environment is adverse to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So, right there, if I form a coalition of manufacturers and try to influence legislation to keep from being regulated so I can keep on polluting the environment, then I'm part of a faction. Okay? That's just an example. A faction is any group, this is his idea, any group that is motivated by a common interest or passion that is adverse to the rights of everyone else and to the permanent interests of the community, adverse to the public interest. So, yeah, that's what a faction is, I think. Number two, how does Madison propose to deal with the problem of faction? Well, this is a very important part of it. Um, he says that there's two ways that you can deal with the problem of faction. One is to eliminate the causes of faction. And yeah, one is to eliminate the causes of faction. And that, he says, is impossible because one way to eliminate the causes of faction is to make the country unfree, because then people wouldn't be able to form factions. But that would to destroy the very object of government, which is to promote freedom. So that's no good. The other way you could eliminate the causes of faction is make everybody believe the same thing and make everybody have a common interest. And he says that's impossible. So as he says, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. There's just no way you're going to get rid of it unless you have a tyranny and makes everybody unfree. So you can't eliminate the causes of faction. What you can do is try to minimize the damage that faction does. That is, admit that in a free society you're going to have factions. You're going to have interest groups that are adverse to the rights of the other citizens, and you try to mitigate the damage. You try to control factions, and that's the way that he goes. And his proposal is to have a republic. That is not a pure democracy, but a representative democracy in the form of a republic. And certainly described that in videos for the Federalist, what a republic is as opposed to a direct democracy. So number three, what do you think of Madison's solution? Would it work? Why or why not? Well, what is the solution again? If we look at the Federalist, he says that the republic is a lot more convenient than a democracy. Why? Well, let's just start reading it from right here. He says the two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So the first idea is that in a pure democracy, there's no representation. There's direct rule by the people, whereas in a republic or representative democracy, there's delegation of power to representatives. And his idea is that, let's see, the effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of the country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves. I don't know how strong an argument that is. That is that representatives will be more likely to keep in mind the public good over private interest. But he admits that that may not always be the case. The bad people may get elected. And then he says this, in the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals, the plotting of a few. And that, however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. Hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents and being proportionally greater in the small republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. What he's arguing for is a representative democracy, a republic, but a fairly large one where each representative is elected by a fairly diverse constituency. Right. Like he says here, the other point of difference is the greater number of citizens, and right here, an extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. What he's basically saying is that if you have you're a congressman or a congresswoman, if you're elected by a fairly diverse, district, then it's less likely that one faction will elect you. You'll have to answer to various interests, and this will keep any of those factions or interests from becoming dominant, if you see what I mean. So he thinks that the larger the republic, really, the better, as long as it can be practical. So what do you think of this? When I ask, what do you think of Madison's solution? Basically, what do you think of Madison's reasons for saying that a republic is the best solution to the problem of faction? Would it work? Why or why not? That's really up to you.